So if you really want a masterclass in modern geopolitical power, I mean, you have to look at the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO.
Hmm.
It is arguably the biggest and, well, most successful military alliance in history.
It absolutely is.
And
And it's an organization founded on a very simple but incredibly powerful promise: collective security.
right.
That promise is really what we need to unpack today because its meaning, well, it's shifted pretty radically over the past 75 years.
Absolutely. NATO was formally set up, what, April 4th, 1949?
Yeah.
And the scale today is just enormous.
Yeah.
We're talking 32 member states now,
Yeah.
30 European, plus the 2 North American anchors, the U.S. and Canada.
And the foundational element, the bit every deep dive into NATO has to start with, is Article 5.
The famous one.
That's the ultimate guarantee, right? An armed attack against one member is considered an attack against all of them. It's the strategic nucleus of the whole thing.
So our mission today is to move past just the basic history. We want to get into the evolution of NATO. How did an organization built, I mean explicitly built, to deter the Soviet Union find a new identity after 1991?
Yeah, what happens when the threat disappears?
Exactly. And what do its current, let's say, controversies from, huge spending increases to its ongoing expansion, what does all that mean for the global power balance today? Let's dive into the foundation first.
Okay, so to really get the modern alliance, you have to see that NATO wasn't just created in a vacuum in 49.
Right.
Its strategic roots, they go back further. You can trace them through the Atlantic Charter in 1941, which kind of set the moral framework for post-war cooperation.
Okay.
And then more directly, you've got the 1948 Brussels Treaty Organization. That created the initial defense structure for Western Europe.
So it wasn't totally new, more like a formal transatlantic commitment to defense that had been sort of brewing for years.
Precisely. And that formality, of course, was exactly what the Soviets saw as a direct threat.
Which led straight to their rival bloc, the Warsaw Pact, in 1955.
And we can pinpoint the exact trigger for that. West Germany joined NATO in 1955.
Ah.
The Warsaw Pact was formed just days later. It was a clear line drawn in the sand. The Cold War world split in two.
Within that early structure, though, some members acted in, well, pretty unconventional ways. I'm thinking about France here,
Oh, yes, for him.
founding member. But they made that very famous decision in 1966 to pull out of the integrated military structure. What did that actually mean operationally for NATO for the next, 40-odd years?
That's a really crucial detail. When France pulled out in 66, they weren't leaving the alliance itself. They still signed the treaty. Article 5 still applied to them.
Okay.
But they refused to put their military forces under direct, permanent NATO command during peacetime. It was all about President de Gaulle's push for, absolute French sovereignty, an independent nuclear deterrent.
Right, Gaullism.
Exactly. And for NATO, it meant a massive operational headache. French forces couldn't join in the pre-planned defense exercises the same way, and NATO headquarters actually had to move.
From Paris to Brussels.
From Paris to Brussels. It made things complicated.
That really highlights the tension, doesn't it, between national sovereignty and collective defense. A tension that, honestly, still defines NATO today.
It absolutely does.
But let's look at the mechanics that actually govern that collective defense. Everyone focuses on Article 5.
Right. And it is the ultimate guarantee. But it's worth remembering this clause has only been invoked once.
Once in 75 years.
Just once, in response to the September 11th attacks in 2001.
So if Article 5 is kind of the ultimate backstop, what mechanism does NATO use more regularly, for handling current threats like tensions on the eastern flank or border issues?
That would be Article 4. Article 4 is the consultation mechanism. It basically just says members will consult whenever the territorial integrity, political independence, or security of any member is threatened. It's really the workhorse of the alliance, politically speaking.
And how often does that get used?
Much more often than Article 5. It's been formally invoked at least 7 times, usually by Turkey, actually.
Interesting. Why Turkey?
Well, think about its location. During the Iraq War, they were worried about spillover. In 2014, after Russia annexed Crimea, and then repeatedly because of threats spilling over from the Syrian civil war on their southeastern border.
I see.
So Article 4 is how NATO manages political de-escalation. It shows unity without immediately jumping to a military response.
Okay, here's where the details get really fascinating, though. If a member is attacked, that Article 5 response isn't mandatory everywhere on Earth, is it? There's a geographic limit in Article 6.
Precisely. Article 6 puts a very clear geographic boundary on the mandatory collective defense trigger. It only applies to attacks on member territory in Europe, North America, Turkey, and islands in the North Atlantic. But, and this is the key bit, only islands north of the Tropic of Cancer.
That is an incredible detail. So like Hawaii wouldn't count, or French Guiana.
Technically, no, not for the mandatory Article 5 response. It really shows you NATO's origins as a purely North Atlantic defensive pact.
Wow. So an attack south of that line might trigger Article 4 consultations, maybe political action, but not necessarily the automatic military response from everyone.
Exactly. Which perfectly sets the stage for the huge operational shift after 1991.
Right. Cold War ends.
The Soviet Union dissolves.
Yeah.
Suddenly, NATO is this massive alliance without its main reason for existing. It had to rapidly find a new purpose, moving from just containment to tackling new things like political crisis management, even humanitarian concerns.
And that search for a new role led them straight into the Balkans in the 90s. This period saw NATO's first actual wartime actions, a massive transition operationally away from the Cold War mindset.
It really was. You had Operation Deny Flight in Bosnia and Herzegovina. In 1994, NATO jets shot down 4 Bosnian Serb aircraft, violating the no-fly zone.
That was a big step.
It confirmed NATO was willing to act offensively, for humanitarian and political goals, not just pure defense.
And that paved the way for the, well, much more controversial 1999 Kosovo intervention, Operation Allied Force. That bombing campaign, it exposed some real splits within the alliance about legitimacy, didn't it?
It really did. The key argument was between the U.S. and U.K. on one side, arguing military strikes didn't need a specific UN Security Council resolution because of the immediate humanitarian crisis.
Right.
And allies like France on the other, who felt that acting without explicit UN backing undermined international law and, frankly, NATO's own legitimacy.
So not just a policy disagreement, but a fundamental one about whether NATO could or should act unilaterally outside a UN mandate.
Exactly. It was a deep divide.
And despite those internal debates, the ultimate operational test arrived on September 11, 2001. Invoking Article 5 then led to the deployment of the NATO-led force, ISAF, in Afghanistan.
Yep, the International Security Assistance Force. This became the alliance's defining mission for almost 2 decades. And importantly, its first major mission way outside the North Atlantic area. ISAF grew huge, eventually involving troops from over 40 countries, allies, and partners.
Showcasing NATO's global reach, as you say. But the end of that mission, the chaotic withdrawal in 2021, many people called it a debacle, the greatest debacle even, some politicians said. What did that reveal about the structural limits of a multinational alliance like NATO?
Well, it showed that keeping everyone on the same page during an intervention is one thing. Keeping that unity during an extraction, especially a difficult one, is much, much harder. Because, fundamentally, operational forces remain under national command. We'll come back to this, but when political agreement back in the various capital cities started to fray, the integrated NATO command structure struggled. It couldn't force a unified, orderly exit if key members weren't fully committed politically to the plan at that moment.
So consensus is needed not just to start something, but critically, to finish it cleanly.
Absolutely critical. And you see that same sort of tension in other post-Cold War operations, too.
Like Libya.
Yeah, take the 2011 Libya intervention, Operation Unified Protector. NATO enforced the no-fly zone, sure, but only 8 out of the 28 members at the time actually took part in combat operations.
8 out of 28, that's a big difference.
It's a key point. It shows that when Article 5 isn't triggered when it's crisis management, not self-defense members feel much freer to impose national restrictions, what they call caveats, or just opt out of the riskier parts, like combat.
This ability to kind of pick and choose involvement must be a constant challenge for alliance cohesion.
It definitely is. And that tension brings us right up to the present day, especially when we talk about enlargement.
Right. Since the Cold War ended, NATO's added 16 new members, fundamentally redrawing the map of Europe.
And this eastward expansion has been, well, let's be blunt, the single biggest ongoing source of friction with Russia.
Going way back.
You can trace it right back to the 1990s. There are memoranda, documents that reveal assurances given, or at least perceived by, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, assurances that NATO wouldn't expand its jurisdiction further east after Germany reunified.
Assurances that were arguably not kept, especially when former Warsaw Pact nations started joining.
Exactly. Russia sees that expansion as a direct breach of a strategic understanding, maybe even a promise. Whereas NATO countries argue quite strongly that sovereign nations have the absolute right to choose their own alliances. It's a core principle for them.
2 very different narratives there.
Yeah.
But the whole dynamic just shifted massively in 2022.
Oh, profoundly. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine completely changed the calculus for two historically neutral countries.
Finland and Sweden.
Finland joined in 2023, Sweden followed in 2024. They decided neutrality wasn't enough anymore. This action, it effectively doubled NATO's direct land border with Russia and completely altered the strategic picture in the Baltic Sea. It's hard to overstate the shift.
And the military response on that eastern flank has been equally profound. You mentioned the NATO response force being fully activated for the first time. What does that enhanced posture actually look like on the ground now?
It means boots on the ground, basically. Immediate deterrence. We're talking about 40,000 troops deployed along that, 2,500-kilometer eastern flank, mainly in the Baltic states and Poland.
And these aren't just rotating troops.
Increasingly, no. We're seeing longer-term stationing commitments. Germany, for instance, has pledged a full armored brigade to be permanently based in Lithuania by 2025. Plus, you have specific initiatives like Operation Eastern Sentry, launched because of Russian drone incursions into Polish airspace. It shows NATO is now in a mode of continuous, high-alert deterrence.
All this military activity, these deployments, they cost money. Which brings us to the famous 2% financial target.
Yes, the 2%.
Since 2014, after the first Ukraine crisis, members committed to spending at least 2% of their GDP on defense, a goal pushed hard, especially by the U.S. for years.
And that commitment is finally really bearing fruit, largely because the threat perception changed so dramatically after 2022. Secretary General Stoltenberg announced in 2024 that a record 23 out of the 32 members are expected to meet or beat that 2% target.
23 out of 32. That's a huge shift, financially and politically. What does that surge really mean strategically? Is it just about, appeasing the U.S., or does it signal something deeper about European defense?
I think it signals a really profound shift towards maybe not full autonomy, but certainly greater European responsibility for defense.
Okay.
This surge represents an 18% increase in defense spending by European members. And Canada, in just the past year, it's about showing European defense is serious. It's about reducing that strategic dependency on the U.S., at least for basic deterrence in Europe. And it's definitely fueling European defense industries. It's changing the continent's whole defense posture.
Before we wrap up, let's quickly touch on the top level of NATO's structure. Who actually calls the shots?
Okay, so the highest political decision-making body is the North Atlantic Council, the NAC. Ambassadors from all 32 countries sit on it.
Yeah.
And crucially, decisions in the NAC are made by consensus.
Consensus, not voting.
No voting, no majority rule. Every single one of the 32 member states has to agree for a major policy or operation to be approved. Everyone has a veto, essentially.
Wow, that sounds almost impossible to manage with 32 different national interests, especially given the divisions we talked about over things like Libya or Kosovo.
It is incredibly difficult, and it's exactly why NATO is fundamentally a political alliance first, which then sometimes acts militarily. That consensus rule is what protects every member's sovereignty. It ensures every voice, big or small, has to be heard and accommodated.
Which brings us perfectly to our final thought. We've traced NATO's evolution, right, from Cold War deterrent Article 5 dormant to this modern crisis management alliance, now flexing its muscles with 23 members hitting that 2% target. But you mentioned earlier, despite all this coordinated power, the alliance itself fundamentally lacks sovereignty.
It's the absolute core paradox of NATO. You have this integrated command structure, SASUR and all that, but the alliance itself cannot perform certain basic sovereign functions.
Like what, for example?
Well, a NATO commander, no matter how senior, cannot actually discipline or punish offenses, like failure to obey an order, committed by a soldier from a member nation.
Really?
Yes. Those operational forces, they always remain under national command. They never lose their national character, their national chain of command for discipline, for law.
So even when, say, a Polish battalion is operating right alongside a German one under a unified NATO field command, the Polish soldiers ultimately answer to Warsaw for discipline and the German soldiers to Berlin.
Exactly right. And this is what leads to those operational limits we sometimes see, things like red card holders.
What are those?
They're senior national representatives embedded within a NATO command structure. They have the authority, literally on the fly, to veto or prevent their national forces from participating in a specific action if it goes against national policy or caveats.
So they can pull their troops out of an action.
Or limit how they engage. They impose national caveats rules limiting where, when, or how their specific national troops can be used, even within a broader NATO mission.
That's a fascinating constraint. So the provocative thought to leave you, the listener, with is this. NATO is this alliance of incredible historic scale and military power. Yet its actual ability to act, especially decisively and quickly, is constantly filtered through this need for 32 separate sovereign nations to agree, both politically and operationally, sometimes down to the actions of individual units. How that delicate, sometimes messy balance of sovereignty and collective action handles the speed and severity of future global challenges, well, that's going to define the next chapter for NATO.